This is the incredibly tough job of a B-17 gunner fighting from a steel ball suspended in the sky. Crouched inside a tiny ball turret hanging beneath the plane's belly, the B-17 ball turret gunner had to fight in extremely harsh conditions, freezing cold, constant vibration, and a space so cramped they couldn't even stretch their legs. With twin machine guns in front of them and death lurking behind a fragile pane of glass, they protected the entire crew from German fighter planes during World War II. The most dangerous, loneliest, but also the most heroic position in the sky. Today let's talk about the legendary flying fortress, Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. The Boeing B-17 is more than just an aircraft, it's a legend. But that legend is as much about the people behind it as it is about the plane itself. It's a story of men with vision and courage. And it starts with a visionary named General Billy Mitchell. His experience in World War I convinced him that air power was crucial for safeguarding America in any future conflict, and that victory would go to the side with superior air power, because this meant striking targets deep within enemy territory. His new ideas drew him into confrontation with the Navy and the administration, ultimately costing him his career. But not before proving his point with the seized German warship Ostfriesland. Beginning with Boeing's B-9, new metal monoplanes replaced the flimsy biplane technology of World War I, resulting in staggeringly rapid developments in bomber design. However, money for military aircraft was always limited, and the purpose of a bomber in a peaceful America was a hard sell. Especially since the Navy had long asserted its responsibility for dealing with any hostile ships at sea. The inter-service rivalry of this era would continue to affect bomber development into the 1930s. But some bomber force, even if only of token strength, was required. The B-9 had a brief career before being replaced by the B-10, which represented yet another significant advancement in design. Aside from training, the only real action they saw was helping with natural disasters, such as performing airdrops to flood victims. They did provide a unique service, and with the Air Corps always eager to demonstrate their usefulness to the public. They were quickly sent wherever tragedy struck. In 1933, one notable breakthrough occurred. The Army proposed a plane that could carry a ton of bombs for 5,000 miles, and Boeing was awarded a contract to develop a single massive bomber, the XB-15. This plane was meant to have sufficient range to strike enemy countries rather than fleets, so there was no conflict with the Navy. Because of its sheer size, the XB-15 wasn't finished until 1937. And while it never became a bomber, it saw extensive service as the C-105 military transport and was used to test the concept of extra long-range bombing. With the Army financing the initiative, the engineers were able to develop technology that would benefit both Boeing and the United States in the coming years. One of the first to benefit was Pan American Airways, as it required great range for its commercial flying boats. Boeing quickly altered the XB-15's wing and other pieces to create the legendary Clipper flying boats, which were for many years the largest aircraft in existence. This concept proved successful, and Boeing acquired valuable expertise in building huge aircraft. Another type of seaplane appeared as well. Modified from the B-10 and supposedly for coastal patrol, the B-12AM project, supported by General Andrews, once again raised the Navy's ever-present suspicions. Early in 1934, the Army requested that designs be created to replace the B-10 with a jet that could carry twice as many bombs and have a longer range. Boeing, low on finances, was forced to make a selection based on a competition between prototypes manufactured at the manufacturer's expense. They had the advantage of the B-15's previously built and tested wing, which could be scaled down. However, this limited the plane to a 4-engined configuration, flying in the face of the popular belief that such planes were, in addition to being expensive, impossible to fly. Incorporating characteristics from their successful airliner, the Model 247, as well as lessons learned from building the B-15, their plane was to prove reasonably straightforward to handle. The increased power was used to improve the plane's performance rather than increasing its size. The criteria were developed over a long series of tests that evolved into the Boeing Model 299. The corporation gambled big on its design, believing it gave them an edge over its competitors, and built the plane using borrowed money. Due to concerns about industrial espionage, stringent confidentiality was maintained. With its design edge, Boeing did not want to give away their advantage too soon. The plane took 11 months to build. On July 1, 1935, the mystery ship was wheeled out of its construction hangar, and it was immediately clear that this was the most advanced bomber ever built. It was capable of carrying 2.5 tons of explosives and could travel 2,000 miles at speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour. It was armed with 5 machine guns and represented a new generation. On the 28th, it made its first flight. The Boeing business had previously claimed with some justification that they had a winner. By the time the 299 landed after her first flight, it was clear that this was an understatement. On August 20th, 1935, it returned to the air for the voyage to Dayton, for the competition completing the 2,000-mile journey in an incredible 9 hours, faster than any of the Army's fighters at the time. Despite the concerns about the performance of their pursuit planes, the Air Corps was pleasantly surprised by Boeing's large new bomber. The remaining 2 prototypes in the competition were both adaptations of existing planes. Martin's B-12 was a derivative of the B-10, whereas Douglas's B-18 was a bomber version of its successful DC-2 airliner. Both were dwarfed by the 299. The B-18, which shared the DC-2's ruggedness, made a reliable mark on history. By the time war arrived, it had been surpassed, and after being refitted as an anti-submarine aircraft, it spent the war patrolling the United States shores. As the competition began, the Model 299 was renamed the B-17. And as the testing progressed with the top brass watching it, outperformed all of the Army standards. Then, disaster struck. Before takeoff, the pilot failed to remove the control surface locks. Simple safety devices meant to keep the controls from moving on the ground, causing the plane to crash. The 299 was unable to finish the tests due to a lack of backup planes, even though it was not the fault of the design. In the firestorm that followed, despite the Air Corps' insistence that they needed the B-17, regardless of the crash, the service chiefs intervened, and the B-18 received the vast bulk of additional aircraft orders. The Air Corps' lobbying resulted in an order for 13 Boeing dubbed YB-17s. The engineers practically went back to the drawing board, and the new planes featured several improvements. Again, the first plane took 11 months to build, and by then, it was 7 feet longer and 1 ton heavier than the 299 had been. With such a tiny manufacturing run, the new aircraft were almost entirely handmade, combining modern technology with people and processes more suited to building buggies. From the time the Army took control of the fortresses, they kept the planes busy. General Andrews was determined to show them off to gain public support for expanding the Air Corps. In May 1938, perhaps as a challenge to prevailing attitudes or just as a publicity stunt, General Andrews had his B-17s intercept the Italian ocean liner, the Rex, when it was 800 miles out at sea. The interception was a stunning success, so successful that the Navy, furious at the intrusion into what it considered its domain, issued regulations limiting the Air Corps' activities to within 100 miles of the coast. The event cost General Andrews his job. Curtis LeMay, the chief navigator on the flight to intercept the Rex, would have a significant impact not only on the B-17 tail, but also on the effective implementation of the strategic bombing doctrine as a whole. Meanwhile, the evolution of the B-17 continued with the B-17B. 3,000 pounds heavier, 40 miles per hour faster than the YBs. With different weaponry and other upgrades, it exemplifies the B-17's continual evolution throughout its production life. Her engines were now supercharged, which allowed for increased speed and sealing. With the Luftwaffe's devastation of Poland in the early stages of the war, all doubts about the notion of the large bomber were dispelled. The first fortresses to see battle B-17Cs and Ds were given to Britain and known as Fortress 1. However, the early British experience was extremely disappointing, emphasizing, among other things, a lack of effective rear armament. Boeing's engineers anticipated some of the British criticism, and the B-17E, which they designed, preempted many of the design improvements that battles showed were desirable. It also included the redesigned tail. The E was so substantially altered that it resembled a new plane with the characteristic lines of the classic B-17. The Fortress was now armed with 50 caliber machine guns, not just from the new tail position, but also from new waist guns, an upper turret, a ball turret below, and additional cannons in the nose of the plane. In theory, it could now defend itself against any comers. However, only the older design was available when the attack on Pearl Harbor thrust the United States into World War II. The demand for the B-17 increased dramatically. Many people did not want the plane before, but now it was desperately needed. As America prepared for war, production was reorganized and industries mechanized. With the workforce depleted by military demands for the first time, large numbers of American women stepped up to fill the void, taking on the burden of manufacturing America's arsenal. To work in restricted spaces, airplane manufacturers purposefully hired small people. With the automation of so many previously manual operations, the scale and pace of manufacturing reached heights unthinkable only a few years before. At its peak, the three companies that built B-17s produced 130 each week, with Boeing's Seattle facility producing 16 per day. They were immediately deployed by the Army. Most B-17s went to war by first flying to England to participate in the strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany. Ground crews worked tirelessly on the fortresses, preparing them for their missions over enemy territory and ensuring that the plane's crews had the best possible prospects of success and survival. The crews need specific clothes to battle the intense cold because the missions were flown at such high altitudes. As raid preparations continue, bombs are loaded into bomb bays. The guns are loaded with freshly unpacked ammunition belts. Each man prepares himself and his stuff. The jet comes to life with the sounds of combat as the soldiers converse among themselves, sharing anecdotes and information about their occupations. The pilots have last-minute conversations with the ground liaison officers. Another vital gear for gunners, the flak jacket, is bulky and awkward, but it is an investment in human life. The throat microphone made critical communications uncomfortable, especially when combined with an oxygen mask. And the mission was gone. The gunners of B-17s play an essential role as they fly into Germany, burdened down by their bomb loads. Their awareness and expertise are the plane's sole defense. The navigators were responsible for the early phases of the bombing offensive due to a lack of good radar triangulation. The British nighttime missions had previously failed to improve their navigation, and targeted targets were abandoned in favor of area bombardment. The United States, on the other hand, bombed throughout the day, shifted responsibility to the navigators, and continued with targeted strikes. It quickly became clear that the fortress's expectations of being able to battle their way to and from their targets were overly optimistic. What had been overlooked was the fact that air control is required for a strategic air offensive to succeed. During the Battle of Britain, the British controlled their skies and successfully repelled the Luftwaffe. However, without sufficient long-range fighter protection for the attacking bombers, this air offensive suffered a similar loss. The Germans dominated their skies, and their fighters cut swathes through the massed fortifications, causing repeated pauses in the campaign and raising concerns that the entire concept might have to be abandoned. On many sorties, whole squadrons were destroyed as casualties reached astounding proportions. Paradoxically, many men survived because of the B-17's almost unbelievable ability to absorb damage and continue flying, no matter how battered. Many planes that returned were dismantled, but their crews owed them their lives. 4 counter-strategies against German supremacy were developed, each with varied degrees of efficiency. First, Curtis LeMay oversaw significant alterations to the formations that the fortresses flew, tightening them and combining the planes to provide more effective mutual protection. By the time these formations were densely packed, they had concentrated 550 caliber machine guns in a hedgehog of firepower that, as long as the formation remained close, made life for opposing fighter pilots much more difficult and hazardous. The close box formation was extremely difficult and stressful for pilots. and the chances of collision and shooting each other down increased. But it did to some extent work. The fortress's massed guns working in tandem undoubtedly resulted in significantly heavier enemy losses. It's been argued that B-17s shot down more enemy aircraft over Europe during the war than all other United States aircraft combined, making its gunners the unsung heroes of the air war. The second change was the addition of an effective forward-facing gun turret. The Douglas Company originally installed a chin turret on fortresses it manufactured in response to complaints that the plane was vulnerable to the Luftwaffe, which preferred head-on attacks. It was an instant success and was adopted into all subsequent B-17Fs and the B-17G. The third development was the B-40, a modified B-17 designed as an escort gunship with power-operated twin 50s on the sides and an additional turret on top. Unlike regular bombers, this jet was loaded with ammunition for its guns. However, this made it exceedingly heavy. And once the other B-17s dropped their bombs, they became lighter and faster than the escort jet. Despite their massive weaponry, the planes performed only slightly well as escorts. The majority of them were created and manufactured by Lockheed Vega, which was now one of 3 companies constructing B-17s. However, the struggle was essentially a battle for air control, and the most effective method to gain control was to create long-range fighter escort aircraft. Aircraft such as the P-47 Thunderbolt, equipped with drop tanks, were the Allies' first serious attempt to provide fighter cover for bombers. The P-38, which had twin engines, was also tested. However, the renowned P-51 Mustang was the first to be effective, and it was most likely the plane that turned the tide of the fight. However, all 3 of these planes played a role, as they all had extended range, high maneuverability, and powerful weapons. They became known as the bombers' little friends. Until after D-Day, when they could take off from French airfields, all escorts relied on drop tanks for additional fuel. These tanks were ejected when they were empty or when the plane needed to be unencumbered before engaging the enemy in combat. For most of the war, however, even with drop tanks, United States fighter pilots were only able to clear the air of enemy fighters during the early part of bomber sorties. For the final leg of the run, the 17s were on their own, and when the fighters were forced to turn back, they had only LeMay's tactics, the gunner's skill, and chance to protect them. The German anti-aircraft artillery known as Flak was almost as devastating as the enemy fighters in terms of total fortress losses during the conflict. Unfortunately, the LeMay formations, which were efficient against fighters, merely provided the Flak gunners with large, densely packed targets for which there was no defense. The final approach was always the worst part of the mission, since the plane was locked into the bombing run, flying straight and level on automatic pilot and guided by the bombardier. It was impossible to change course. Therefore, luck became their sole ally. Their bombing campaigns eventually proved to be one of the deciding factors in the war. As the planners had predicted, crippling Germany's military production and destroying her transportation systems. They even served their purposes as German petrol shortages grew so acute that the Luftwaffe was eventually forced to ground what few planes it still had, rather than waste fuel to combat them. The bomb drop was critical to the mission and the B-17. Despite being lighter and faster without their bombs, the returning 17s were still vulnerable to German day fighters, with just the gunners to protect them. Despite the gunners' best efforts, numerous planes were left vulnerable to the superb German fighters. Because of the weight of the ammunition, the bombers typically took off with approximately 500 rounds per gun, slightly more for the rear gunner. This meant that the gunners had only around 1 minute's worth of continuous firing ammo. Even when severely damaged, the B-17s were frequently able to return home. Perhaps the 17's most valuable asset was its capacity to take flak and survive. The opponent did not cause all of the damage to the B-17s. The close box arrangement resulted in some crashes. The B-17, named All-American, famously survived being hit by another B-17. The tail gunner, a very fortunate man, also escaped, having just left his position to inspect the tail wheel before the collision. Many B-17s that were too damaged to be repaired were sometimes used to assemble composite planes, patchwork bombers, to make up for the massive losses. Tired B-17s that were too old to be refurbished were also used as radio-controlled flying bombs in a project codenamed Operation Aphrodite, loaded with 22,000 pounds of explosive and operated from a parent plane, or in this case, the ground. They were more successful when used as launch platforms for guided bombs. During the war, the United States recovered unexploded German V-1 flying bombs, which were never utilized. But the United States experimented with its own versions. Some were launched from ground ramps, but the majority were fired from B-17s for maximum range. While the Fortress is most commonly associated with the European theater, it saw extensive duty in the Pacific. In reality, it was the only four-engine bomber available when war broke out. The 17 saw duty at Midway Rabaul and in countless more attacks against the Japanese, who, like Germany, lacked comparable range-lifting capacity and adaptability. Incredible footage even exists of a B-17 practicing an attack at an incredibly low altitude. This is in a plane constructed specifically for high-altitude flight. The wide expanses of the Pacific, however, demanded more range than the Fortresses could provide, and soon B-24 Liberators with even greater range and completely automatic pilots would take over much of the heavy bomber job in the Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur, the Allied commander in the Pacific, who would eventually accept Japan's surrender, employed 5 specially adapted B-17s for transport. The general's luggage and undoubtedly top-secret secrets are being put onto one of his jets under the cautious eyes of his aides and military police. Model 299's transport application was studied well before the war, when Boeing used its wing and tailplane in the Stratoliner. This, the first pressurized transport aircraft ever built, featured a redesigned fuselage, but was otherwise identical to the B-17. Many served throughout the war with their 4 engines, allowing them to cross the Atlantic without fear of assault. During the war, no stratoliners were constructed since Boeing's major Seattle plant, like numerous other manufacturers, was dedicated to fortress manufacturing. Boeing's pre-war learning from the pressurized high-flying stratoliner was still applied in the war effort, albeit in a different plane. Even before the war, Boeing and the Army were investigating the effects of pressurization on crew and aircraft as a completely new bomber was on its way. This plane, the B-29, would fly higher and farther than the B-17, and pressurization was the sole alternative to the uncomfortable and limiting oxygen mask. The B-29 Superfortress was a new generation of bomber capable of crossing the Pacific, which had previously protected Japan from effective Allied bombing. Thousands were constructed, but it only took 2 to bring the battle to an end, employing new weapons of destruction with unimaginable strength. With such technology available to the Army Air Force, it would appear improbable that the old B-17 would play any part in the post-war years. But this is not the case. Curtis LeMay, now a general and deputy chief of the Air Staff for Research and Development, is about to see the employment of atomic weapons against naval targets in a test that is vastly different from intercepting wrecks in pre-war B-17s. The drop will of course be made by a B-29 at a test location in the Pacific. But the consequences are unpredictable, and much information about this new sort of weapon is yet to be obtained. As the Superfortress pilot and crew prepare for the bomb drop, other preparations are underway back at base. A converted drone B-17, heavily modified and entirely radio-operated from the ground, takes off. Once in the air, another B-17 modified as a mothership and carrying airborne radio controllers will steer the drones to the testing location. The drones and mothership reach the outside edge of the test area where scores of surplus naval warships will be destroyed in one explosion. The B-29 makes its final approach to the target as the bomb aimer adjusts his sight. While kilometers away, Navy crews prepare to witness a new form of dread. Seconds after the shockwave, the mother plane sends the drones into the atomic cloud, where they fly gathering data and samples in special collectors. The remotely operated drones can travel where no manned aircraft can safely go into the radioactive aftermath of the test. The drones are returned to base, and the mother plane turns over to ground control for landing. Once down, the drones are meticulously handled by specially trained personnel who remove the materials obtained by the now contaminated aircraft. The samples are dispatched, and the aircraft is thoroughly cleaned with special equipment. The radio-controlled drone was not something the Model 299's creators could have predicted. The West had just recently gained a monopoly on atomic warfare before losing it. And thus came another conflict, the Cold War. Since the 1950s, the United States has been on constant watch for Soviet planes that could devastate the country with ground-to-air missiles poised to respond to the bomber threat. Ground-to-air methods had to be explored, and once again the pilotless B-17 drone was employed. The controller aboard the mother plane monitors a television screen depicting the cockpit of a drone about to be sacrificed to demonstrate ground-to-air effectiveness. In this, the Fortress's final service role, many of the B-17s were shot down by the Bomark, one of the most successful ground-to-air missiles, which was also produced by Boeing. It may seem like an ignominious end for such a storied aircraft being used as a disposable target, but they were intended specifically for war, and their tight interiors were not conducive to peacetime use. As a result of being obsolete as military tools, most of them were simply demolished at the end of World War II. Perhaps this was an ignominious end, but perhaps it was appropriate. After all, they had done the job they were built for and done it well. They had been produced in large numbers, exceeding 12,000, and had suffered severe losses, with over 5,000 lost in combat. They were so important that enormous production capacity was devoted to them. 3 aircraft manufacturers built them. 2 companies, including Studebaker, manufactured their motors. Allis-Chalmers, a farming equipment manufacturer, converted their plant to make superchargers for them, and famously, a brassiere manufacturer was retooled to produce nacelles for their engines. The work they did, particularly over Europe, helped win the war, And the design advances involved in their development may still be seen in civil and military aircraft of later generations. The handful that continue to fly are cherished treasures, not only for the memories, but also because they are still wonderful planes with their grace and power. Powerful reminders of a legendary aircraft and the generation that flew it.